Of William J. Murphy of 4332 Shady Hill Lane, Lansing, Michigan. Bill's phone number is area code 517-323-4166. The recording was made on May 21st, 1990 by Jim Walkinshaw of the Oldsmobile History Center at 4000 North Grand River in Lansing, Michigan. This is tape number 1 of 2 tapes. Okay, Bill, if you could just start with your name and your address and your phone, if you would, please.
Right, I'm Bill Murphy, 4332 Shady Hill Lane in Lansing. Phone number is area code 517-323-4166.
Okay, now if you could just go back, Bill, and kind of start us with when you started, where you started at Oldsmobile.
Yeah. I started on June 7th, 1941, in the accounting department. Started as an accounts payable clerk, working for Mike Boughton in accounts payable department. Stayed there for 3 years and then transferred over to the contracts department. This was a department that handled the government contracts at Oldsmobile during World War II.
What were you doing initially when you came in the accounts payable bunch?
I would take an invoice, receive from the vendor, and I'd match it to receiving stuff.
All right.
That was a real
tough job.
Oh, difficult job.
Yeah. Where were you located, Bill, at that time?
In the old administration building, Building 60, fourth floor.
Okay.
That was the unrefrigerated or unair conditioned building.
All right.
Which,
what did you do in the summer then? When it got hot?
Oh, you opened the windows. There was a constant battle between, people wanting the window open, people wanting the window closed. These are real different conditions from today.
Yeah.
That building was a really well-built building too. And one of the funny things that I remember in my career is when they decided to tear the Building 60 down.
Yeah.
The building was built in 1929. I can't even remember exactly the date they tore it down, but it was to move into the new administration building. Yeah. And this is kind of hearsay, but somebody was contracted to demolish the building. And he went up there and hooked up a couple of cranes or drag lines or whatever they called them with a big ball and hit that building a couple of times and didn't even dent it. Knocked the windows out. But they had a terrible time. That was really a fortress.
Structurally, it was built solid.
Yep. Okay. And
so anyway, you stayed there for 3 years handling bills.
Yes, there are progressive jobs that basically what you're doing is finding out what was received from the customer or the vendor, matching it to his billing and paying him or adjusting for any difference.
So were you working with big books or ledgers or that kind of stuff?
No,
what were you
no, you just work with the documents themselves.
All right.
They were of course all posted ultimately, and then the payments were processed through the accounting department and through general ledger. You would adjust, take your payables off the books and take the cash out of the bank.
Anybody have a computer in those days?
No.
What did you? No, did you have any mechanical?
Yes. In those days, you'd have an adding machine, which you pull a lever.
Okay, no mechanical.
No mechanical adding machine. And you really didn't have a heck of a lot to do except checking invoices once in a while to make sure that the people multiplied the stuff right, things like that. But it was basically a clerical job, really not an accounting job.
All right.
So then moving down to the contracts department is a very interesting department. It was neither fish nor fowl. The people in that department reported to a man who was an executive assistant to the general manager. His name was Bob Griffin. I don't know if you've ever heard that name.
I have.
And he really had charge of government work at Oldsmobile. It was something the general manager delegated to him. And there was a lawyer in that department, a fellow named Marv Salmon, who later turned out to be a judge in Lansing.
Interesting.
Yep. And we had Mike Boughton exercised a little control over that department, but basically I was working for some people, and I frankly don't remember all the names. But I do remember, of course, Griffin, because he was the one that our work came from and went through.
Okay.
And we go down and add amendments to contracts, examine contracts when they came through, have the general manager sign them, take them to Detroit, have them signed there, that kind of work.
Okay.
Went on and on and on.
Were you dealing with the government at all?
Directly, yes.
Okay.
We would.
So you were the intermediaries?
Really a gopher.
Uh-huh.
What would happen, take the case of the 3.5-inch rocket, which covered millions of units.
Yeah.
The numbers were restricted at that time, and now they're public domain.
Oh, yeah.
But let's say you'd complete a segment of the contract, and the government decided they want more, X million more, and they want to deliver such and such a time. They would initiate an amendment to the contract.
All right.
We would review it, talk to manufacturing, see if you can do it, study the language, get it signed, take it to Detroit. The legal department would sign off on it. They'd have a vice president of GM sign it. We would take it back to Jefferson Street down at the river, Detroit Ordnance District. And that's what was done. And I might say that during that time, Oldsmobile made the 3.5-inch rocket shell. They made the 75 and 76 millimeter gun, made the barrels, and my recollection, the breech blocks.
Okay.
Shipped those, and then we made a 30 millimeter automatic revolver, which was really a wing gun, a wing cannon.
Yeah.
That came out of Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. So there was a little travel involved with these things too.
Was there any? Were you the guys that haggled about prices and those kinds of things?
And the man who was in charge of that was Harrington.
Okay.
At that time, and really, I guess you'd say that I worked for Claire in that capacity, even when Claire kind of moved out and turned the department over to me. He was and it was interesting to negotiate. And on a big contract, you'd have Bob Griffin, down there with you to negotiate. I'll tell you a story about that sometime.
Okay.
After the contracts department, though, pretty well wrapped up, then I went into taxes and insurance department, Oldsmobile, worked for Cliff Durr.
Cliff was there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And in the 50s, bingo, I got pulled off of that job and put on a temporary job, and I didn't realize what was happening on it particularly or why I was there. I worked for Frank Bold as a cost engineer.
Oh, yes.
He'd go out in the plant and try to find some ways to save money.
All right.
But, as I say, that was strictly temporary because along came the Korean War.
Yeah.
And during the Korean War, we started making the Sapphire jet engine, which was we made the power plant really for the engine. Buick was the original contractor, and they supplied the complete engine. But the real technical, high-tech parts were made here, and we had to build a plant to make them.
How did we get
Plant
involved
3.
in that thing to start with?
Because Buick got the contract from the government.
Yeah.
Why Buick, I really don't know, except they may have had some expertise or something like that.
Yeah.
The engine was a Rolls-Royce engine, incidentally, strangely enough. You wouldn't think that would apply in wartime, but but Rolls-Royce held the patents. We had to stay within certain areas, but of course, as the engine developed, I'm sure our engine was better than anything that was made in the old days. And that involved a lot more running around with contracts and inspectors coming through and developing costs and proposals and that kind of thing. Quite interesting, but real drudgery after a while, except for big changes and big conferences.
But we were working through Buick in essence.
Buick was the prime contractor.
Were we going back and forth to Buick then?
The contracting officer, this was such a big job, actually resided at Buick. So it wasn't very far to go. And we were over there half the time. Herb Holmes was the representative for manufacturing on that contract. Little Herb Holmes.
Yeah, I remember her.
Terrific guy, and we spent a lot of time together. And well, as a matter of fact, Herb wrapped up a few of the World War II contracts. Yeah. He was the knowledgeable guy when it came to manufacturing information. And the biggest job that we had, and which was pretty much spearheaded by Holmes, was getting rid of all this equipment out of Plant 3 when the Korean War was finally over. Yeah, terrible.
Bill, and this may be not a good question, but in those kinds of both World War II and that kind of thing, were those contracts on the basis of, so to speak, cost plus, or were they on the basis of some other thing?
Good. It was a kind of a mixture. You would bid a contract at a fixed price basis. So much a shell, so much a gun tube, whatever. And you cost it against that contract differently than you would against an automobile. For example, your commercial expense, where you paid for all the dudes in the General Motors building, and all of the advertising and all that, was not allowable against a government contract. Right. There were certain phases of it, however, allowable, because you had to deal with certain vice presidents and things like that. Those rates or ratios were developed by the General Motors Corporation, and apparently they had to get those approved by the United States government. It came to us. After we got all through, the biggest job that we had then was to take our sales, then take our actual costs, as opposed to the estimated costs at which you bid the contract. You would sit down and you would rework your whole profit and loss statement based upon using your actual costs and your allowable charges for central office expense, engineering, help, things like that. And then you had a parameter that you had to fill in with. It was quite interesting. And then you went down and negotiated.
Okay, so you had your actual cost plus our overhead that the corporation.
Right. And you said we were charging you an X number of dollars a shell, and it looks to us like it cost us so much.
Yeah.
So apparently we're making 12%.
Yeah.
Now, you're not allowed to make any 12% on the government contract.
Yeah.
And I forget exactly what the rates were, but they were very, very low compared to your commercial operation. So you would, in fact, you better strike the figure 12%, because that might throw somebody off. We never made anything like that on the government contract. As a matter of fact, to my knowledge, although there may have been specific instances, General Motors always leaned over backwards. Now, the trouble was that your contracting officer and your GAO, or General Accounting Officer, whoever were involved in these negotiations, would like to lean over a little further.
Get the cost further down.
Get the price further down. Right. So it was a great thing to go down there and negotiate, because a half a point or something meant a lot of money.
I saw notes, Bill, where we actually kept reducing the price level.
Oh, absolutely.
Things, and just kept selling them lower and lower and lower.
Basically, because the government might be buying let's quit talking shells or guns or anything like that, but the government might be buying something that cost of $1.
Yeah.
And so General Motors might bid it at 75 cents. They said, we ought to be able to make that thing.
Right.
And by the time you really got going and you had your benefit of your volume in the thing, you might go to 60 cents and 50 cents, and the government just kept hauling that money in and smiling, and they were happy.
Yeah, and we kept lowering our price, didn't we?
We kept lowering our price because we'd have to give it back to them anyway. But it was very interesting to go through those things and to watch a master like Bob Griffin at work. Herb and I tried to do it several years later, but he had a real business knack, and he was very well liked by government people, and it was fun. It was fun to watch him. So,
well, got off track there, but that's okay.
Well, we get into that Sapphire jet engine, which was primarily what we did with the government. We might have had a little blip on something else, some small contract that we would perform, but that was the big job that we did. You remember that was the proving ground for a lot of your friends over there.
Oh, yeah.
The Bob Mooney's, the Charlie Armitages. I think Dick Whiters is over there. Quite a group of young manufacturing process people were in that job. And Don Wilson was the shepherd watching over there. He collected those cups. After the Sapphire jet thing, I think that wound up in the mid-50s, and all of a sudden I got put on the job of operating out of the cost department and handling the price studies for the General Motors division. This is where you actually estimate your sales, your costs, your profit, your tool charges, the whole thing
For the car, no.
for the coming year. Well, wherever you're making.
Okay.
If you happen to be making something else, you can do that too. Like we used to make a lot of forgings, as you know,
Right,
sell to
on the
different people.
outside.
Yeah, and with that job and producing the price study, it naturally led into going over the costs with engineering and with the general manager, and Ed Stevens, who happened to be working in that job, became ill, and I replaced Ed.
Okay.
And then started the grind of going down to staff meetings once a month and going over the cost of the cars, which was a real experience.
Okay. This is the Oldsmobile staff?
Yes,
Or
Oldsmobile staff. You know. And that would involve going to styling quite a bit and dealing very closely with the engineers and really acting as a mediator between engineering and the general manager. Engineering would like an item on the car, they'd like to make an improvement, they'd like to do something, and we would have to develop the cost. And the guy who did that was a terrific guy and hard man to deal with. It was Gail Price. And you know Gail. Gail was an artist, an engineer, a bookkeeper. He was a kind of a hybrid guy that could do most anything. He could now look at a car, take a piece of paper, and draw that car. It was you'd almost photograph. And then he'd go in there and identify those parts as the material, the shape, the cost, what would it take to buy it, to make it. And then we would review it with the general manager and then chief engineer, and the chief engineer was always upset because it cost too much. But it was a very interesting phase of the whole operation.
Now, their bill, we must have dealt with more than just labor costs and that sort of stuff. We must have dealt with a lot of different kinds of.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's say one of the big problems that you always had because it affected another division was your tail lamp assembly. And in those days, and I guess it's still today, I haven't paid much attention to the automobiles lately. They all kind of look the same to me, but you change your tail assembly every year. And it always had to be a little fancier than the year before. It had to look fancier. And generally it was fancier, and generally it cost a lot more. And generally it took up a bigger part of the quarter panel, and Fisher Body was always very jealous of anything you did to their body. Fisher Body, of course, was the biggest supplier that we had. Biggest cost that we had for an individual part was the body. Then Gail would go down and somebody would have a wonderful tail lamp assembly. And he'd look at it, and he would measure, draw it up, describe the material. You know, you might be going to stainless instead of something else. I don't know. And it always seemed to cost more. And then you'd have to, as you say, get the labor cost involved in treating the pieces or just sticking them on as they came from the vendor. Whatever you had to do, you would have to estimate that. And then you tell the general manager, a tail assembly is going to cost $1.25 more per car. And then he would say to the chief engineer, do we really need this? And the chief engineer would say, well, yeah, it's beautiful, but man, I didn't think it cost $1.25 more. But that's the way the things were hammered out. And that was just I was going to say that was a small example, but it wasn't, because it was appearance, and it was very important on the car all the time. You had the same thing with the grill. Your
front bumpers and rear bumpers.
Yeah, and anything that, well, the size of wheels, you know, yeah. I was never really aware of all the little different things, you know, that was done to cars to raise and lower your hood line, to the tooling. That's another thing. Sometimes you'd have a part that was a nice improvement and maybe a significant increase in cost, but the tool bill was tremendous. Whether you had the tool bill from getting dies here for your plant or to buy them for the vendor, he, of course, had to charge you back for them. We spent a lot of time on this, but that was a very interesting thing to go down and see the drawings on the wall. I don't know if you've seen them in the dialing. Okay. And then to try to translate those into costs, and then you compared it with your cost for the year before, and then you compared it with the cost from last month, and you try to trace that thing. And then the real day of reckoning was when you actually produced the price study and found out that how close your estimate was to build that individual car.
Did the volume have any? It must have had some major effect on all that.
Well, this is a little I'm sure you can understand it, though. You would base your price study upon 80% of your capacity. There was a general rule at General Motors that's the way you did it. You priced your car based off your capacity.
Okay.
So you priced it at 80% of your capacity. That was known as standard volume.
Okay.
Your tools were absorbed at standard volume because you were making a price study and you were trying to make money at let's say, a normal volume. 80% of the capacity of your plant would be a good, normal year. For that reason, once you passed the break point, once you passed your standard volume and went to what we call index or actual, index was an estimated actual, and actual, of course, was your actual. When you made a price study, you priced your car on the basis of a standard volume, let's say 400,000 a year, 600,000 a year. And then you ran it out at index, and on that extra volume between standard and index, let's say it's the difference between 600,000 and 800,000. That extra 200,000, you had no tool absorption going against that, and you really then got into significant profit improvement per car. So that's the way that was. And of course, you're going to pick up inherent improvements even at different stages of standard volume or normal volume. I mean, the difference between producing 300,000 and 400,000 cars, you're going to get a lot more labor efficiency. Sure. You're going to get a lot better cost. We're back to the example of the shells and gun barrels and things. The government never saw things made like that so cheaply. And so
I think they're on all the technology.
You know, this is jumping around, but I want to go back to the 76 millimeter gun barrel, which was about as dull a piece of thing that you could imagine just thinking about it. A serious gun, 76 millimeters, 75 millimeters. Yeah. But when we went into that, there were terrible problems in machining gun barrels, because gun barrels had to be pretty sturdy metal. Yeah. And they were cast in different places, and there were burrs and there were holes and there were all kinds of problems when you went to machine a gun barrel. They didn't cut like butter. And we had trouble trying to figure out how the heck do you cut it without cutting up all your tools and doing a good job. We had a man named Arnold Hanson. Does that name?
Oh, sure.
Arnold Hanson, to my knowledge, was the best superintendent I ever dealt with in the plant. It was sad that it had to be during wartime. But he had a knack. He could handle people. He understood metal. He was the best, I think, superintendent we ever had. Now, Bob Rouse might know, of course, would know better. But from my standpoint,
Sure.
anything we wanted to know, he knew. He understood why you wanted it. And boy, you could see the production of those plants day and night. And further comment on that, when the transmission fire occurred, Willow Run, we took some real hot items out of that assembly to make here at Oldsmobile. General Motors just pulled all the plugs and stopped everything and brought their real experts in and said, we got to make transmissions, you know, and you guys have to help. So it was significant to me that the man who was put on that job was Arnold Hanson. He was quite a bit. It's just sort of disappeared. You know, I often wonder what happened to him.
So he retired like everybody
Maybe
else.
you'll hear from him. I hope. He's a little older than I was. Okay, but
Bill, and I hate to keep backing up.
Sure.
Standard volume was a number that was kind of low, and it grew and it grew and it grew as time wore on.
as capacity changed, yes.
Did that present any peculiar problems as that all happened?
No, you would just adjust your approach. Basically, what we were talking about was the distribution of tooling and engineering expense and things like that, which are more a fixed amount. That's where you had to absorb all of your fixed charges. Biggest thing was your tooling. You'd have depreciation and everything else.
But as your volume went up and down, fluctuated from year to year, as your standard volume went up, then you had to be able to make more cars, so to speak, to quote break even.
Not quite, Jim, but close. You would make money at standard volume.
Yeah.
You priced to make money at
So you
standard
had one of
volume.
those bad years where the volume was down below standard volume.
You got beat.
You were in trouble. weren't
You were in trouble, and there was nothing that could be done. Yes, but going up in standard volume did not give you any great problems. Because going up in standard volume, you merely changed your floor. And usually when your standard volume was going up, things were fine, and your index volume was going even higher. It's kind of a difficult concept, but basically, when you got it all on paper, it came out pretty well. Because when you had a standard volume, and let's say 600,000, which is not a good figure, and your index volume of 800,000, then by interpolation, you could quickly come up with a profit based on anything. 650, 750, $1 million, anything. And that's the kind of thing that your general manager would be asking you about from time to time. As a matter of fact, Jack Wolfram, in dealing with him, he was the first fella that I knew that I dealt with, other than in financial, that really seemed to understand that thing. And I remember the first time he came up with a projection of 1 million cars. And he said, this is what we're not going to be fooling out with this kind of stuff very long. I want to know, what it would take and what kind of pricing we should use, and we're going to make 1 million cars and see if we can't really, bust the old bank. And he did it, of course. No problem. Oh, well, problems. Yeah, you guys do that. Yeah, but he did it. And that was very interesting to try this kind of untested territory. For me, I don't know how many divisions were doing that. I'm sure a lot of them were, but I carried with me at all times a sheet which was probably, I'm showing you, 2.5 to 3 feet wide, which listed every car that we made, every car that Buick made, and every car that Pontiac made, trying to put like series against like series and developing the price that we would have for those models and how it would compare with Buick and Pontiac. Then Wolfram wanted to know, well, what are we giving the customer for that extra dollars over Pontiac? And what is Buick giving them that we're not giving them? But let's give them as much as we can against Buick and, that kind of thing. Carried it all the time. And he just looked at it and...
Was our biggest competitor those two guys, really?
Yes. We might as well face it. Sure. Oldsmobile, in those days, we had our share of the market, and we tried to make, of course, we all did, try to make the best car that we could, give them the best value we could, and make the most money we could. And yes, and Pontiac was quite a problem because they loved to come out with a car that was basically like a B body, similar to our '88, and try to sneak in a few things there and hold the price down, and it was a battle. Those were the days when DeLorean and Belts used to go at each other.
I see.
Wonderful. Wonderful to see them do it. Yeah, there's no kidding about it. I never made a spread that I.
Okay, background.
This I was saying, I don't think I ever made a spread or comparison against Chevrolet.
Oh, yeah.
Or Ford, or any Ford product like the Mercury. The sales department was quite interested in that kind of thing, naturally.
Yeah.
But we knew our figures, and I guess probably we knew the Pontiac and the Buick figures better than the other guys.
Were those kinds of numbers available without too much digging, or was that a big job to dig out Pontiac and Buick kind of numbers?
Well, you always had a little trouble finding out where they were going in the following year, price-wise. And you'd pick up some things and you'd do some estimating and things like that. But basically, it was pretty accurate, let's say. And
people were pretty closed lips, so to speak, if you were talking to your counterpart at Pontiac.
Yes, I wouldn't tell them, but there were ways of finding things. There's a big network, and through styling and places like that, I'm sure that general managers got information. I think they were more or less entitled to it, some of it, and they interpolated a lot. But basically, though, the history told you where they were going, generally.
Yeah.
And if we were selling a particular type of car for X amount of dollars more than the Pontiac, in the following year, it'd be pretty much the same kind of thing. The question was, what kind of value were they going to give and give their sales department to operate against it? Pricing of cars was a strange thing. I guess maybe I should tell you this too, that as you developed all of these different items of information, they were given to Detroit. And particularly when you were coming out with some kind of a new model, you not only had to work pretty closely with your manufacturing people, your purchasing people and everything for different parts and everything, but you also had that target out there as what that car was going to sell for. Good example, Jim, would be the Tornado.
Okay.
When we made the Tornado, it was a brand new concept.
66.
Brand new, yep. And very secret. I used to get look at papers from all over the country, and they'd always be whispering about the Tornado, what kind of a car it was going to be before they ever really knew. But I will never forget that one time I got a call to go down to the general manager's office, and I dashed down there. I had a horrible feeling that something was wrong, and walked in, and Irma Norton says, "Jack wants to see you." And I went in, and he said, "What's this?" And he threw me a copy of the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal said, the price of the Tornado, the Oldsmobile Tornado, is going to be X amount of dollars, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And he said, is that a good number? And I looked at it and I said, it was. He said, what do you mean was? And I said, that was our price about 3 weeks ago. I couldn't, he got the information, but he could have expected to remember. And he says, what do you mean? And I said, well, we've changed it. And I don't remember which way it went, probably up, because that was what happened when you're developing a car. And he says, well, how did they get this figure? And I said, I had no idea. And he said, well, now wait a minute. He said, who knows the price of this car? And I said, well, you do. And Dick Elliott does, or maybe it was Earl Shonett, I can't remember. And I said, I don't think even Gail Price or anybody like that knows it, but General Motors knows it. Well, now, wait a minute, he says, who knows that? And I said, well, Dak, we come to you and we tell you, they're asking us about this car and everything, and they're plotting and scheming down there how this is going to fit. And he said, yeah. He said, well, Elliot and you and me, huh? And I said, that's right, sir. And he says, did you give it to him? And I said, no, sir. And he said, okay, takes care of that. He said, Irma, let me talk to whoever it was, Ed Cole or somebody. I got out of it. But it was quite interesting how you tried to protect that information. You just talk about those things and other things pop in your mind. But anyway, so I did get out of that. Finally,
That must have been, excuse me for interrupting, but was that kind of what I would call a kind of a high pressure sort of situation in general?
oh yeah, I would
Not necessarily pressure, but it's a fast paced, really
it is
going sort of thing.
Yeah, because you're always running to catch up. You're always trying to get the price study done. You're always trying to keep the numbers current because
It's a never ending.
Never ending. Yeah. Well, I've kind of come to that because it got to the 1972 model.
Okay.
And I got to talking to Mr. Wolfram one day, and he was a little concerned about me. I guess I was getting a little tired looking or something at a particular time. With 14 years of that's really enough. And I said, yeah, I said I'm really and I've really had a lot of different jobs, very little accounting to tell you the truth, but I'm just wondering, where I want to go. I'd like to do a little more my career type work sometime. And Jack said, I can understand that. And I think what really happened was that they were looking at some people from central office to come and do some work here. And that's when that vote came to Oldsmobile shortly after that. And I was very glad to get out of that and get into handling part of the some of the other departments in the county. And it just so happened that at that time, unfortunately, John Niehaus died, and I became the assistant controller and took on several more departments, and then
which were basically regular accounting.
Yeah, the cost department, and at different times I had every department in the county department experience in it, with the exception of payroll. Payroll always at that time reported to the controller directly.
All right.
There's some interesting thing I might add here, that when you talk about the staffs at Oldsmobile, we'll get into this a little later, but I want to make this point right now so that I never forget it. Everybody at Oldsmobile worked for the general manager. Everybody worked for Jack Wolfram. Everybody worked for Metzel, whoever the general manager happened to be. But there was one slight exception. The controller reported to the general manager, but he also reported to the controller of General Motors.
Where was a solid line?
There's pretty solid line.
In both directions.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to have one boss.
You had two bosses, your controller. And it was quite interesting. Here at Oldsmobile, I don't know that it ever made any difference. But there were some serious differences at other divisions.
Okay.
And of course, the auditors from General Motors, when they came to a division, would audit everything in the division, and they would also audit the general manager's special account, review all of his expense reports, et cetera, et cetera. But that was an interesting thing, and it held true all the major divisions of General Motors, and I'm pretty sure the smaller ones.
And that was kind of from early days on?
Early days on, always. Now, I don't know what it is today, but today, it's so complicated with the VOC and stuff like that. I really don't know, but I'm sure that the controller is responsible. If he has a little problem and he cannot resolve, he has to tell the general manager, I don't like this, I have to object to it. As I say, I don't remember ever having any serious problem. Our general managers are pretty understanding. So,
Did Ed, excuse me again, did Ed replace you then, basically?
Ed replaced me on that job.
On that
He
job.
was, kind of a general supervisor kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then Ed went to Dayton as either controller or assistant controller there. I think it's controller there.
Yeah, I think it was.
And then when Dick Elliott left, Ed came back. So,
Okay, so now you had a whole mess of regular.
we had a whole mess of regular bookkeeping departments, and it was kind of fun and great sport until
Uh-oh.
another bombshell hit. Material control under Alex Retzlaw and later under Harold Blow slowly started developing the punch card routines and wiring up boards and everything to do their work. The computer had started to arrive. And that was fine until the computer started costing lots and lots of money.
Oh.
And IBM started bringing out these great big machines. And then somebody, someplace at General Motors had a idea, called everybody together and said, beginning next year, the data processing function will be reporting to financial tech guy. Okay. So I got another department, and that department turned out to be, 80% of my.
Like an elephant.
Yeah, right. And that was quite interesting to be in on that development. You had to make a lot of different decisions, but of course, here again, you have the GM network, and you have other bookkeepers and other divisions that are going through this same thing. How do you buy a $2 million computer? Do you rent it, or do you lease it? Do you take a chance and buy it that'll last forever? And after you had one of them, you knew that was never going to happen again. So and then that had to even, fortunately, had developed a separate budget, because what happened later, it became a separate division. And while it was growing, though, it was just full of potholes, and every staff, and logically enough, saw places where they could use data processing and maybe cut down your manpower, or some places where you could use somebody else's information, or some places where you could get somebody else to do your job. The basic stuff nobody wanted to fool with anyway. Logical, but very disheartening. And we were kind of lucky again, though. We had the Bob Ronaldses and the Johnny Beltzes and guys like that. And I forget whose decision it was. It might have been suggested by General Motors, but I got told one day by the general manager that I was to form a committee which would review the work that was going on to those machines. You get a new machine, and in 6 months if they could be loaded, or quicker than that. And everybody was complaining that everybody else's work was not important, and it was a kind of a Solomon type job that nobody could do right. But if you had Bob Rallis sitting in on a meeting, and Bob Cook, and people like John, although John wouldn't go unless it was really serious, and I don't blame him. You could write the report and say, this is it. I mean, we're going to do this job. We're going to do this job for manufacturing, and here's what we think it's going to take. And then you'd save all that stuff. So you'd have a big armload of added work and everything to show to them at price study time to explain why your budget went up.
Okay.
That's about the way that worked. And I guess that that went on, and in 1980, it appeared to me that it was about time for me to retire.
Oh, you got to 1980 in a hurry there.
Well, you see, I worked through the 72 model in cost estimating and price study.
And then you had 8 years there.
8 years, yeah, of which the last 3 or 4 were almost totally immersed in data processing. We had
that was the emerging era.
yeah, then we had some really great accounting guys. I mean, nobody else would recognize a real great accounting guy except an accounting guy. But I want to tell you, you probably have had a lot of experience with him. But Phil Hassler, to me, is about as good and as solid and as tough a administrator as I've ever seen. And of course, it's pretty obvious now. I mean, he is the chairman of the board of Water and Light, and got a good job at Oldsmobile. I think he's kind of like a equivalent to what used to be an assistant controller.
Yeah.
But he's kind of the old head down there now. Does the job.
Yeah.
So that's really.
When did you actually? Do you remember the actual retirement date now?
Yes. Well, the retirement date's August 1st, 1980.
August 1st.
But as usual, I had no vacation.
Oh yes.
And so I was going to quit in time to, take all my vacation as a retiree. And of course, things kept coming up. I don't remember when it was that I got out of there. I think it was around pretty close to the 4th of July that I actually
finally got out there.
And I was oriented by the time the elevator got down to the basement. I was all retired. No problem.
That's good. That's all right. Well, that's a good
Now,
coverage of that.
yeah, I did want to talk a little bit about the staffs.
Okay.
And here's the way they were organized. Now, this is basically through my entire career.
Sure.
Unfortunately, there's no BOC or anything at that time. Right. That's going to be another matter.
That's a different subject.
But staff meetings were held every Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
The staffs were divided up not by any accounting basis, but actually the way things sort of developed. And you'll see what I mean when I go through this. The manufacturing, of course, Bob Rollis is the one that I remember. There were others, of course, during my tenure there, going back to Tom Downey. Bob Mooney, of course, but whoever was the manufacturing manager at the time. And I don't know, did Bob ever get to be manufacturing manager as such? Yes, he did. Yeah, I remember now.
Cook. What's that?
And Cook, yeah. But whoever it was, and I have here manufacturing, Rollis or Mooney, would be at the staff meeting.
Okay.
He might have a fellow or two. Manufacturing was peculiar in the instance that the man that ran manufacturing pretty much sat in the staff meeting and spoke for manufacturing. That was not true of all staff. But I would see Mooney in those meetings when he was not manufacturing manager. You would see people like
Ken Knight, would he have done that?
yes. Now you're talking. Ken Knight was generally there during history.
Manufacturing engineering guy.
Right. Right. And of course, I remember a lot of the folks, including yourself, that we used to deal with in the various facets of manufacturing, including, the John Howes.
Sure.
People like that.
Guys out there doing it.
But in the staff meeting, let's say Rollis and one other fellow, or Mooney and Ken Knight, something like that. 2 people. The product engineering department, the chief engineer was always there, unless he was out someplace, and he always had an assistant chief engineer, and he kind of used to rotate him, depending on what
But not the same guy all the time.
Not the same guy all the time.
Okay.
It could be, well, you have to kind of talk about specific times too. When John Belts was assistant chief engineer, I think he was at staff meeting at least 90% of the time, because John Belts was John Belts. And but it could be a Bob Schultz, or it could be somebody like that, equivalent type guy. We always big fella, Jim Lewis. Jim Lewis, yeah. Sure, once in a while. In the sales department, you would have the general sales manager. He might have somebody like Clemison or Waite, assistant sales manager, with him. Then, of course, service. Service is not a staff head, but this is one of the little exceptions that I like to talk about. You had Claire Oxendale, when he was running the service department, was a very important man at Oldsmobile. He was not a staff head, but you'd see Claire Oxendale in that staff meeting quite a bit, because you're always talking warranty costs, and you're always talking these recall things, and how are we going to do this, and how are we going to do that. Top kind of guy. And then, of course, I think it was Panza that replaced Oxendale, very small length of time, and then he went to General Motors, and then Stebbins would be in those meetings. But see, that's not a staff head, but their service you'd see there. Reliability, of course, when I started, was not even a staff. And then when it was organized, Tommy Tompkins, who was assistant chief engineer at the time, was put as the head of reliability, became a staff, and he would be at the meetings as a staff head, and he might have somebody like Redburn or Armitage from time to time. Financial, of course, either had Schoen or Elliott or Vogt, whoever it happened to be.
One guy.
Oh, no, he'd always have a sister. Yeah, and generally, at the early part, the only one that was involved would be whoever happened to be handling the price study and the cost estimating and stuff like that. But later on, we did rotate a little bit. Material control, that became a staff, as I recall, while I was there. First, it was part of manufacturing, and then it developed. These things became so important. The scheduling, the timing, and everything of parts. The importance of getting proper startup. You'd always hear at the staff meetings, well, the purchasing department isn't doing this, material control hasn't finished that. So finally, it became a staff, and a pretty good sized staff. As a matter of fact, Van Ness was sitting right next to, he was sitting right next to you. Yes. Yeah, all right there, 6'4". Very important staff. And Van, which is a pretty good guy too. Then public relations, which really, from the standpoint of manpower or lady power, was not a great piece of the organization, but it was quite important because of the kind of things that they did, and the kind of, we became very conscious about public relations, probably after the Nader thing. They developed. Personnel department, of course, was always a big department, and it was run by big people. I mean, Bill Mahoney, when he was in his heyday, was about as important a man as you'd ever bump into from Oldsmobile. And Cutler, when Cutler took over, he was kind of a pretty good imitation of Bill Mahoney, and they ran the personnel department, and I think they ran it pretty much as a local operation. I mean, about as far divorced from General Motors as any staff could get, and they'd negotiate, all night half the time, and knew how to do it. And Cutler went through so many of those with Mahoney that there was no transition really that I could see. Now, after that, they started appointing personnel directors out of Detroit, just like everything else. There'll be no homegrown controllers anymore at these divisions. The homegrown controllers got to be willing to go, someplace else for many years, or go overseas or something, and then come back.
Did they have that? did you see that sort of thing change?
Oh,
over the
absolutely.
years? It went from more local people to
Absolutely.
outsiders?
Yes, I thought for a long time that I was going to be the last assistant controller that was made from Oldsmobile, but Bill Robinson did follow,
Yeah.
and that's it. I don't think you'll ever get any more.
Uh-huh.
Even the well, of course, counting now for Oldsmobile is a small,
entirely different. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's a GM man the last I knew. Okay. So that is the way, and boy, you can't talk about all these different staffs.
What went on, Bill? What was in general the purpose of the staff?
Oh, okay, yes.
What was it to do?
Well, I haven't really done too much thinking about this, but I think it generally you can pick it up. The staff meeting agenda was pretty much set by the general manager, although if a staff head had something that he wanted to cover, he would get to the secretary of the staff committee. And that was a very interesting job because the secretary was in name only.
Oh,
there were no notes there.
Nobody took minutes or any of that kind of stuff?
Now, I won't say that somebody didn't make shorthand notes or anything like that.
Sure.
There were no published minutes of any staff meeting.
Really?
But the accounting department, I probably should start there because I'm much more familiar with that. We would go in once a month and we would give a quick rundown of the status of Oldsmobile as we were operating against our goals, as we were operating against our price study.
Okay.
Generally in related numbers. We didn't deal too much in the absolute numbers, but we had to tell this general manager in particular and the staff in general, we were doing well. We were, and based upon our sales and kind of stuff like that, we were in the ballpark where we should be, saw no problems, which show the performance of manufacturing against their budget, the labor budget,
Right.
things like that. Show the manpower for each staff and how they were operating against the manpower they're supposed to have.
That's like numbers of people?
People, heads, absolutely. That's, yeah. And then we would show the cost of we have a selected car. We have a 98 four-door, we have a 88, an F84, whatever we happen to be making, we'd have the typical car of the series and show the cost of the car versus the price study versus last month, which was real fun. And you could do that. I mean, you could get it and you'd finish it, 15 minutes before staff, and you'd run up there and show it. And it was a lot of fun until every once in a while somebody like Mr. Wolfram, who of course had the option of doing whatever he wanted, would say, well, good, I see where our 98 is doing real well against the budget, and it's improved over last year. How does that compare with the Buick?
There you are. Huh?
Yeah. So, well, that would take 3 weeks. I mean, you'd have to start and accumulate the data just like you did for your own. So we would have to tell them, we don't have it, and but we can get it. And well, that'd be a good idea, he'd say. And you better do it. And you do that for 6 months, and you might ask for it once, and then you press the business, you'd have to let it go.
Yeah.
But there was always more work than anybody could do. But I would say that you're telling them what your performance was. You're laying out your 4-month forecast. The biggest job that the accounting department does now, or did, I'm sure it still persists, is not to record costs and grind them out and show what your profit and loss has been. The biggest job that the accounting department does now is tell you what your profit's going to be. And the general was required that on a 4-month basis.
Okay.
Every month you update
Forecast.
Yeah, that's the most important thing that bookkeepers are doing now. And that gets into inflation and all the rest of the stuff that we didn't even have to fool with 40 years ago. So, all right, so much for the accounting department. Now the sales department would, and this was all done with flip charts, the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. Now, when we went into the new administration building, and they got a little fancy with movie cameras and slides, and it got more professional. And probably a little nicer. The manufacturing department, they, as I can recall, the manufacturing department, there was always something that was giving us fits. And the proper guy would be in there, you know, Roberts would bring it in. And, well, maybe it related to warranty. You know, was it a question of how the thing was built out here, or was it the vendor? And anyway, if it was initiated by manufacturing, they would have made the research on it. And they covered, you know, the problem that we're having. You know, you can't put the dumb part together, whether it's whose fault it was, and then we thrash it out. And the general manager try to get in on it, or maybe say, well, Bob, why don't you and ask, you know, and put a couple guys on it. Did you ever work on this? I shouldn't be interviewing you, but you've been in staff meetings, haven't you? Now, what kind of things were you talking about there?
I always thought of it as basically a communications get together. And resolution of some problem.
Yep.
But I suspect, didn't the general manager flavor it to some degree as you change general managers? I mean, Wolfram was probably different than Cook, who was probably different than whoever else, and Belts, and how and what they wanted to see. Did that change at all?
Yes, there were some things that that Wolfram asked for that other people didn't put that much stock in. But basically, I would have to say, from my experience, that the communications and the tenor and the stuff that was handled in staff meeting was pretty much determined and didn't change too much from Jack Wolfram.
Oh, didn't? Okay.
Now, it's to me, Jack Wolfram commanded more of the discussion than the succeeding general managers. But there was never any doubt who was the general manager in any of those meetings. I don't care whether it was Wolfram or Metzel or Belts or who. It was the general manager. But Wolfram would expound maybe a little bit more than the other. No. Warranty. Warranty was a very serious problem, and it was recognized as such. And I could see now why a general manager would feel that way, because if your warranty costs are high, you've got problems, and if people are bringing their cars in, they're upset.
It's indicative of their quality.
That's exactly right. And I think it may have even been the reason.
Of William J. Murphy, 4332 Shady Hill Lane, Lansing, Michigan, 517-323-4166. The recording was made by Jim Walkinshaw on May 21st, 1990, at the Oldsmobile History Center at 4000 North Grand River in Lansing. This is tape number 2 of 2 tapes.
Okay. Engineering department in those meetings would bring the staff up to date on the different projects that they had underway, the testing, where it stood at any particular time on the new model, changes that they might have been making in the vehicles, and the reasons why, to improve, something as we went along. Sure. Sales department, of course, they were right up to date. Where we were selling cars, where we were not selling cars, different problems in different areas of the country, and then there'd be great discussion among sales, engineering, maybe manufacturing as to why, Why were the batteries not standing up in a certain part of the country? Well, we had problems with this in different parts of the country.
Was there a lot of, I'll call it finger pointing, so to speak, or was it?
There was finger pointing, but it was a last resort.
Okay.
We would have a situation, and this was my job as being a bookkeeper, that Elliot was not going to embarrass anybody in that meeting.
Yeah.
Unless we covered everything. Oh, yeah. And you wouldn't go into a meeting and say, well, engineering has changed the dashboard on a car, or they've gone to a new something else, you know, and Wolfen would spin around and say, well, what's that for? And Metz would say, well, I didn't expect to be talking about that here, Jack, but so and so and so. You never did that. I would spend no, on Tuesday morning, the staff meeting started at 10, and at 9:30, I'd be sitting with John Belts, and I'd be saying, John, you know, this is going to this point. We have got to bring this up. And John would say, okay, I'll tell you what you do. You just say this. You just pose the problem.
Yeah.
I'll brief Metz on the way over. So it went nice that way. Okay. There have been times, you know, when they manufacturing and service, but not under Bob Rollis's tenure that I can ever recall that anything like that ever happened. I got to put in a comment about Bob Rollis right now. In the years that I worked at Oldsmobile, I would have to say that probably the most respected and best liked guy, executive, Robert T. Rollis. That's come from a bookkeeper. And
why was that?
I don't know. It's because he dealt up front. And they all did, I think, but he was more family dealing up front. I don't know why. And I mentioned to you that there was just a standard saying around Oldsmobile that Rollis knows everything that's going on in that plant. He had connections. He was just a terrific guy. The second guy, while I'm mentioning him, that I thought that was really the most highly regarded was Jack White, who's a public relations guy. Now, a lot of people, they have this difference. A lot of people out in the platform have never heard of Jack White. But when you sat in a staff meeting or outside of a staff meeting, it was people bringing up something, you know, it wasn't that so-and-so Jack White. It was like, no, Jack White feels this way about that. And of course, Bob Rollis. He was the guy, and he had thousands of people working for him. It was just amazing how he could hold the respect of everybody. I only saw Bob Rollis get upset one time.
Really?
Yes, and he got upset at a real good man, Ed Cole.
I can see why he got upset.
We're down reviewing the budget. There have been some misunderstandings in the instructions from Detroit that hadn't been filtered properly to the staffs about what General Motors is going to have to do. We're going to have to really crack down, you know, the great big costs.
This was during one of those crunches.
During one of the crunches, and we went down and we reviewed the budget. First, you review it with the bookkeeper guys, and then you review it with their big shots, whoever your VP happened to be at the time. And this Ed Cole was in this meeting. I don't know why. He was either the vice president in charge of the divisions, or he was the boss of their division. And it was a very friendly meeting, and Bob was sitting there steaming. He felt that he'd been unfairly treated in the budget. And we'd convinced him and argued with him and fought with him. And I got to admit that the bookkeepers weren't too clean on this. I think there was a little bit of overtraining. But they got all through and breaking for lunch. And then Ed Cole, of course, he felt like Bob Rollis is. Most everybody did. He thought he was a great guy. He goes over and he kind of pats Bob on the shoulder, puts his arm around him a little bit, and he says, well, he says, I think you guys, Bob, he says, I think you've got a good budget there. And Bob says, that is not my budget, Ed. Ed looked like he'd been shot. I was just close enough so that I don't know what I said. I said something to the effect that, you know, all these tightening regulations and everything really hit manufacturing, Mr. Cole, and they're tough, they're stringent. And Bob says, "You bet they are." Uh, Cole said something to the effect, "Well, do you think you can do this?" When you can't take a budget down and say you can't do it. And of course, Bob had exploded then anyway. And he said, "Well," he said, "we're going to give it a try, Ed." But I really was surprised to see that. I hardly ever saw Bob Ross do that. So, well, see, we've gone all through all the staff people, and I say again, that's prior to the BOC business like that. We talked about data processing, you know, the transition that occurred there, and now it's over to EDS, which is a really unique situation. I can't imagine how that works with another division right in the middle of your plant with people all around it. Another thing that happened, and I mentioned Fisher Body. Fisher Body was a very powerful division in the early days. I think the Fisher brothers still had quite a bit of influence. I think they were on the board of directors, things like that. And they were very tough to deal with, and it seemed to me that you didn't have much room for negotiation when you dealt with Fisher Body. And during my tenure, it was real interesting. There was a man named Charlie Booth. Charlie Booth was nothing but the controller of Fisher Body, and if you looked at an organization chart or something, you'd say, well, that guy is, he can do a good job and not make any noise, and, you know, nobody pay attention to him. He ripped out the middle of the General Motors building one time when he didn't like the offices, and he redid the Fisher Body offices down there, and they were so much better than the ones on the 14th floor. That you know, there was quite a bit of comment and discussion about it, I'm sure. He was known as the King of Fisher Body, Charlie Booth. He was. I have gone to sat in meetings with Charlie Booth, and it's just amazing. You would think that he was the head of General Motors. Went down with Jack Wolfram one time to discuss body prices with Charlie Booth. And if you want to see a negotiation, you ought to see Wolfram and Charlie Booth go head to head. But unfortunately, Charlie had the power, you know. And I think Mr. Wolfram made some impression on him, more than anybody else. Of course, we couldn't bring anybody bigger than that. And but Wolfram was frustrated. When we left, the sheer magnitude of the force that Charlie Booth wielded, and that was the final heyday of Fisher Body, when Charlie retired with a lot of fanfare, good wishes from everybody. A fellow named Tom Clevin, who was a brilliant guy, wonderful businessman and accountant and everything else like that. But I think he's deliberately put in there to try to mollify people and give people a little more information. And Fisher Body, the beginning of the end was in sight. I think Charlie overdid it. And
they just wouldn't give it all.
No, and they wouldn't even tell you. That was the bad part.
Really?
You could argue about a hood ornament or something that Fisher did, change the material in a seatbelt or something, and then get them, you know, for 25 or 50 cents, and you come back and there'd be a $14 million tool bill in the mail, and they'd say, "Hey, we need it."
Just tough rock.
Yeah, that's $14 a car. You know, so, but they were a great organization, and of course, you know, the problems that always occurred between Fisher Body and the car divisions. I mean, you had bad paint, and you had dented metal, and all that thing. But it was you had to be on your toes all the time, and I didn't envy the guys that were negotiating with Fisher, although I used to do some of it. Yeah, I see. Some of the things that I just wanted to mention, that while I was going through this thing at Oldsmobile, and having a few different jobs and things. I told you about the administration buildings turned out to be indestructible, and that was a real point of conversation for a long time. There's also another little interesting story which I was affected by that I'm sure not too many people noticed, but Jack Wolfram, that was his dream, that administration building.
The new one.
The new one.
Yeah.
And I guess they delayed the building for a long time until they could get the right marble for the outside, because Jack didn't like the original marble. Well, that was the general story, and whether it was true or not, I don't know. But it's only incidental to this part of my story. To my knowledge, that Jack Wolfram worked on that so long and so hard, I don't think he ever set foot in the new administration building. He died.
I think that's true.
Another interesting thing was that John Niehaus, who was the assistant controller at that time, during all that building and everything, and helped to furnish the offices and everything, you know, or as a head of the administration building as such, died just shortly before the building was completed. It affected me directly because that was the time when I replaced John and the office. He designed the office and everything else, and I always felt so queasy about it. John had a picture in his office of the Oldsmobile car racing the train.
Oh yeah,
this historical picture. Yeah. And he said, when I leave, that picture's going with me, because he really liked that. Of course, when he died on the way home, on the way home from work, and that picture was there until I left. But J.F. Niehaus and J.F. Wolfram never got to their offices over there. Yeah, that was too bad. The biggest, what am I trying to say? The biggest transformation that occurred in the operation of the vehicle itself was the Tornado. And I was just lucky to be involved in that right from the start, and watched Belts and those guys develop that car. I remember the way they tested it, and one day I was talking to John. I don't know, we might have been in a car going someplace or something, and he said the biggest problem that we've got with this thing is to develop that engine, you know, and then change the drive, the force back up to the front wheels, and rather than shooting it back to the ordinary powertrain. And he says, we're going to do something a little different on this thing. And he says, would you like to know how we're going to do it? And I said, yeah. And John says, well, what we're going to do, we're going to cut that transmission right in half. And he said, we're going to take it back halfway. Then he said, we're going to open it up and we're going to turn it around. And he said, we're going to have the drive wheels, or the force of this transmission, and we're going to shoot it up to the front wheels. And he said, you know how we're going to do that? Transfer that force, you know? And I said, no, how are you going to do that, John? And he says, we got something real high class. We're going to put a bicycle chain on it. And I looked at him, and then I started to laugh, and he said, what are you laughing about? And I said, well, what are you going to do it with? And he said, bicycle chain. And he laughed, you know, and he says, well, it ain't much different. He said, it's going to be a chain. The only way that we can figure to do this thing is to do it smoothly and everything. And I got quite a kick out of that. I didn't.
Was he just punning you?
No, they actually.
Well, I know they used a chain, but
they used a chain. Oh yeah.
Discussion was he?
John always did that. He always had advice. He would put it like that to get your attention. I can remember one time at a meeting with Pontiac where they were discussing the merits of the F-85. This is going to be unibody construction, or was it not going to be unibody construction? They gave the assignment to Oldsmobile, take the unibody argument. Then they said to Pontiac, no, get separate frame. So come down with your arguments. Well, they all came down, and Pontiac went on first, and they had drawings and all of the way that this thing is going to work and why it should be separate frame. It was a wonderful presentation, actually made by John Delory. And he got through, and they said, "Okay, any more discussion? No. All right, Oldsmobile. What's your opinion of this? Why should it be unibody?" John Belch gets up. John was smoking a cigarette.
Okay.
And when he did that, you always worried about the ashes of the cigarette because John never flicked them off.
Oh, they just got longer.
They just got longer and longer, yeah. And John got up there and he says, "You've seen this wonderful presentation by Pontiac." I'm not quoting his exact words. I'm giving you the drift of it. He said in Pontiac, in order to fortify their feeling on this matter, it had shown you a bunch of Crayola drawings. They had drawings up there of different colors. Yeah. John says Crayola. I mean, when he would do that, just like the bicycle chain thing, you sat there and thought, boy, these things, they're certainly better than Crayolas, but that's what they were. Yeah. He was kind of guy.
Well, what happened?
We went unibody, but I don't think I don't think.
What, did he have a fancy presentation too?
Well, he had taken our car and modified it, which was even better. So, yeah. Well, yeah, and he was going to show it to him. That's my recollection of the way it went. We don't fool around with Crayola. Well, that's typical, John. I told you in our little discussion before that Wolfram was pretty much recognized as a tremendous man, real dictator, and very, very tough on people. Yeah. And I guess I would have to admit that he was. I've seen a lot in General Motors of strong leaders who brooked no interference and no argument or anything, and Jack was somewhat of that type. But
was that evident kind of in the staff meetings and those kinds of things?
Yes. He would cut people off, and they say, "Well, we don't want to talk about that anymore," and that kind of thing. But in my experience with Jack, there were a couple instances that showed that he was a real human being at heart. It's sort of the heart of gold within the the rough exterior and stuff like that. And a couple occasions that happened to me when he really showed genuine interest, in myself and my personal problems. And I never really, outside of the first few times when I ran through the buzzsaw, when I wasn't prepared or something like that, I never had a great deal of problem with Mr. Wolfram. Admired him quite a bit. I guess I'm just lucky.
Well, I don't know. Must have been something there.
Yeah.
They just learned.
Well, I told you when he inquired about my son, which surprised me one time. My son was ill. Another time, we were traveling, and Jack, he had a kind of sense of humor. He liked to needle a little bit too, and we finished the meeting and we headed for the dining room at this hotel. They had a banquet, or should say a banquet. They had dinner set up, and he says, "Murphy," he says, "you're going to be happy to go to dinner today." And Jack knew that I was Catholic, see, and it was a Friday, and when we had those meetings, I would just eat everything but the meat and enjoy myself. I didn't eat too much anyway. He says, "I knew it was Friday," he says, "and I knew you were here." He says, "We got shrimp Newburg." And I said, "Gee, thanks, Mr. Owen. If anything I hated, it was shrimp."
Really?
Oh, I've never mentioned it either. But, just that he thought to say that, whether he was kidding or not. I remember one time that I went to Chicago, made a quick trip down there to see my brother and sister-in-law, and we drove up in the car. It was Sunday afternoon. We were going to have dinner there and then really enjoy the evening. Yeah. And then the next day I was going to come back to Lansing and go to work on Tuesday. And we're walking up the sidewalk, and my sister-in-law came to the door and she said, "Bill, somebody named Irma just called and wants you to call this number." So I called. This really ties together because I got a hold of Irma and she says, Jack Wolfman wants you in the official body tomorrow morning at 7:30. And I said, okay. I said, do you know what it's about? And she said, well, yeah, he's talking about that too, Bill. He said he discussed it with you. And I said, I understand. I was meeting with Charlie Booth.
Uh-huh. Oh.
Jack he didn't fool. I remember instances where you would finish a staff meeting and the people would get up and start to go out and he'd say, I want Metzel, I want Feely, I want Murphy. We're going to have a car downstairs in 5 minutes. We're going down to Starbucks. He didn't ask you if you had brought your lunch. You know, what you going to do?
Man? Just kind of
so we're going
to do it. Yeah.
So we went.
Uh-huh.
But talk about going first class. Jack Wolfer. He'd take the whole staff to Minneapolis, New York. There's a few others I don't exactly remember. Get you completely away. One of the first guys that I ever heard do this and have a seminar.
Not an auto show or something?
Just have instructors from New York University or Columbia or something like that come in and talk to you, or University of Minnesota, and maybe people from these big organizations that would specialize in giving messages,
Sure.
give you tests and everything else. It was really fun.
Yeah.
But boy, you stayed in the top hotels and ate big meals, and if you did have an evening off or something, you go to a play or something like that. Jack did not go second class. Should we finish this up?
So keep going.
Well, let's keep going till this ends. Huh? Okay, I just want to tell you a couple of things. We went to a meeting one time. John and Metzel were developing a lower priced 88.
This is John Bell.
John Bell. So trying to pull a Pontiac.
All right.
See if we could get that car out there with the lowest price and steal somebody else's business. And I had finished my work. I'd given everybody all the numbers I could. And I sat back in the next to the last row of chairs. Must have been 100 chairs, and there's probably 14 or 15 people in there. And Jack Gordon, Metzel, Belts, some of the other vice presidents were there. Gordon was the president at the time. So I'm sitting there real nonchalantly, and all of a sudden Jack Gordon looks out in the audience, and he looks at me, and he said, "Excuse me," he said, "I didn't see you sitting there, Fred." He said, "Maybe you'd like to come down here and get more involved in this." And this voice says, "No, Jack," he says, "you guys go right ahead." He said, "Sooner or later, this will all get down to dollars and cents. Go ahead." And I looked at it was Fred Donner sitting there. How he sneaked in there. Boy, did I sit straight after Ed Cole, I told you about when Ed came to the Oldsmobile, and Bob Mooney, after listening to Ed, came back and he said to me, "Are you sure this is Ed Cole?" And he made the comment, he said, "How can a guy with a job that big be such a nice fella?"
Oh.
And that was Ed Cole, pretty good description of it.
Ed was that kind of a guy?
Ed Cole? Oh, yeah.
He was a people person?
He was a Bob Ross type.
He was another Bob Ross?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, wonderful guy. Jack Gordon, when he was president, at one of these meetings that I talked about where they discussed these different cars, well, they were discussing the F-85 in general. We'd have a meeting and they decide we got to take some money out of this car. We'll have a 1-note horn instead of a 2, and we'll have a 10-gallon gas tank instead of a 12.
Right. 3
weeks later we come, we got a 2-note horn and a 12-gallon gas tank in the car. And I'll never forget Gordon one day, he said, "I have to work," he said, and I like to work, he says, and I go to these meetings and everything like that. He said, "We take money out of the car, I come back 3 weeks later, and I find the stuff is back in." He said, "I hope you guys realize," he says, "that I don't come to these meetings just because I love my work." He said, "I'm trying to accomplish something." Tom Murphy, when he was the the divisional vice president, and when he became the chairman of the board of General Motors, was to me the epitome of a fellow that became a very important man and never lost his sense of perspective. Particularly a sane man. We were at a meeting, strictly a financial meeting one time, when they had the people from all over caught there. We finished dinner. Don Wilson and I were together. We thought it was great to be able to go to those things, but we had work to do. So we had to go back and work half the night. So we get out and we're scooting out to our car. And the only other person that was going out, scooting out to his car was Tom Murphy. He was the chairman of the board at the time. And he came over and he said, "Are you fellows going?" And we said, "Oh yeah, we got to get back." And Tom, he talked to us and he clapped me on the back, and said, "Well, take care of yourself, Murphy." And he goes over. His chauffeur was standing there waiting to let Tom in the car. Tom goes over there, and I heard him say to the chauffeur, he says, he said, "That guy's named Murphy too." He wrote me a nice letter about it. Strictly because of the name. I'm sure he noticed me there. But there were quite a few Murphys running around in the financial staff too. Boy, he is a regular man. I had met him since I retired. And he's just the way he was now. Yeah. He came up behind me after one of the stockholders meetings, walking through the tunnel. Came up behind me, put his arm around me, and wanted to know how I was doing, and my son almost fainted. But he's a wonderful guy. The other people that I was mentioning that I knew were the legal department of General Motors, and how great they were and how smart they were. Cannot, as I told you, for the life of me, understand how anybody can get in trouble with government contracts, kickbacks, anything like that. Of course, it does not happen, notice, in General Motors as often as it does with the other big contractors. But that's just a kind of a quick survey, and
you've shared a lot about Wolfram. Can you share any more about some of the followers that came along after Wolfram?
Well,
Metzels and the Beltzes and those kinds of people.
Sure. Well, they were all different. But as I mentioned when I was talking, you never had any doubt in your mind about who was running General Motors in those meetings. All those people. Metzel was very quiet. He was, well, I guess I would have to say that he was not overly friendly type of fella. And, but brilliant. He was smart. Jack Wolfram knew what Metzel could do, and he wasn't making any mistake when he made him. But he, quite opposite to Jack, was not impressed by a lot of parties, a lot of events.
All right.
He did a job. In fact, I heard Metzel say at one time, the part I liked least about this job is getting up and making these speeches and going to these occasions that I have to go to.
I'll be there.
But he went. He did the job.
Was he still an engineer at heart, though, or what do you suppose was making him say that?
He was not impressed, I don't believe, by the track, the real track. I don't think he ever intended to go down and take Fred Donner's job or Ed Cole's job or anything like that. They asked him to take that job, and he took it. Well, I would think that Harold Metzel would just as soon have the best job available in the Lansing, Michigan area. That's what he did. Mm-hmm. And he did it to a T. I don't think anybody ever said that that Oldsmobile didn't stay right in there with Metzel running it. He got the people that he needed to do the job. He put the job in the right hands, and he got it done. He was not an easy man to get to see. Now, that might have been different from staff head or anything. I had more difficulty talking to Metz than I did with talking to Belts. Okay. And now let's go to John. John, absolutely brilliant. As I mentioned to you, in his book, DeLorean has very little good to say about the meetings at General Motors, where they bring the general managers down and review trends and give instructions and trade information, except for Belts. He mentions Belts twice in his book, and he mentions them with a lot of respect. And he had a real sense of humor. But a lot of it was biting, and John had no time for people that really weren't interested in doing their job or working hard or being up to date. He had no patience with that. You had to know what the answer was, or you wouldn't give it to.
Did people say I don't know, or how did they do that then?
You said I don't know. The first time you might not have. The first time you might have said, well, I think this is so and so, and that. But they were all like that. Wolfram was like that. I sat in a meeting one time, and I had gone over a option that engineering was planning. And I don't know who I was talking to. It was somebody like Jim Lewis, or maybe even George Jones, or one of those guys. And the option came up in the staff meeting. And Wolfram says, well, what is this thing? And there was dead silence. And Metz says, that's a new one on me. And if there was an assistant engineer there, he didn't know. He didn't say. And it was painful. And finally, I said, I've heard about it. Wolfram says, okay, what is it? And I knew I should have shut up, because I said, well, as I understand it, and I started to describe it to him, and for everything I said, he had another question. And finally, it got to the point where I said, I don't know. I said, I heard, about it and talked a little bit, but I don't know these details. And Wolfram says, you know what I think? And I said, no. And he said, I think you're guessing. So you don't do that.
That's kind of.
That's the way they all were.
Shuts people off.
That's the way they all were, though. No, I mean, if you knew, fine. But if you didn't, shut up. We got a staff meeting going here. And I've made the mistake a time or two, but, not too often.
Yeah, right. But Belts managed entirely different, didn't he?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they all were different. They all were different. Wolfram, the archetypical big business giant, and tremendous mentality. He's the first guy I ever knew that used these records. He put these things in his ears when he went to bed. Mrs. Wolfram told me this one time. He's studying French, and he's studying this. Yeah. And never failed to try to better himself at all times. And shining star, supported Broadway plays, lived, operated in society, high society, and enjoyed, just loved it, and promoted Oldsmobile all the way. Harold Metzel did not do that. Harold Metzel, though, was a great engineer, and he knew Oldsmobiles, from the beginning to the end, and he did everything that was required of him down at General Motors and held Oldsmobile's place. Never gave an inch to anybody. And then you have John Belts as a splash. I mean, John had a wonderful vocabulary, great fundus stories, sparkling wit, but tough, and didn't hesitate to call spades spades. If you hold them, Bob Cook was a surprise to me, real revelation to me. When I saw Bob, operating in manufacturing, and he was very manufacturing oriented, and he was a tough potato in all those meetings and everything. And when he became general manager, it was amazing to me how he softened up all of the financial part of this thing. And I knew he was doing the same thing with sales. And he was a kind of a composite. See, Cook was a great golfer, loved to play golf, and I mean, he was good at it. And he knew how to handle himself. He was an athlete, a good athlete. He had that carriage, competence, in anything. And he would get his briefings before he went to central office to those big meetings. You'd think that he'd be scared to death. I know I would be. If you gave me that job and you went down there, you're supposed to know everything that was going on at Oldsmobile. Everything about everything. Well, he took his briefings and he went, and he never overdid it. He'd say, "That's enough. I've got it now." He explained something real complicated to him. He'd say, "Fine." Yeah. Baker, of course, never saw. Yeah. And there was another fellow that we haven't mentioned, of course, during the course of this meeting was Bob Truxell. And Bob Truxell was quite an outstanding operator at Oldsmobile. And to the extent that when they announced the appointment of Cook, they made a special point to, as much as say to Bob Truxell, "You're next. Don't feel bad." And of course he did. He went to GM Truck and Cook. Yep. I actually heard that, and was a surprise to me because I didn't think they would say anything like that to anybody. General Motors, they usually promise you a job after you got it.
Yeah,
They
right.
didn't promise you anything.
Now, the other bunch of guys you haven't talked about much, Bill, is Tomtrol. Earl Schoen.
Oh, yeah, and hey, they're just as different as day and night, and they all did the job. Earl Schoen, to me, is the Horatio Alger of bookkeepers that I ever bumped into. He's a local boy, born and raised, I guess, out in Hazlitt there, right around Lake Lansing. Right. And went into Oldsmobile and just fought his way through that thing, resisted all efforts from General Motors to encroach, built that financial organization, and to the extent where he was often called by the financial people at General Motors for his opinion on things. Very brilliant man. I was talking to Earl Schoen one day about manpower, and we had a fellow who was working down in the department, and he had some problems, with sight, things like that. So we had him on a job where he didn't have to use his eyes very much, and he was doing the steel invoices for us. There weren't too many, and there were lots of money, so we could have it fairly easy. And I said to Earl, I said, "Well, we have so-and-so." And he says, "Yeah." He said, "No." He said, "What does he do besides the steel invoices and things like that?" The guy on a desk out of 400 people down the hall. And I said, "Earl, that's what he's doing, but there are an awful lot of steel invoices." And he said, "Well, how many or something, and we talked about it. And I said, I can go get you a batch, And he understood. And I told him the reasons for the thing. He said, "That's good. He's a good man. You wanna take care of him." To me, that was amazing. Mm-hmm. And I got to admit that particularly when it came to data processing, you have a few hundred people running around down there, and somebody said, "What is Joe Dokes doing?" They said, "Well, he's a programmer." Yeah. Well, yeah, but what does he do? Yeah. I don't know. The boss says he's good. Yeah, that's Earl Schoen, and I've seen him tangle with the other staff heads, and if he was right, he never gave an inch, and he kept his temper under control most of the time, practically all the time. But he was a brilliant guy. And Dick Elliott, Well, now you're talking about the typical General Motors executive.
Okay.
Well, you know, with the latest clothes in the country club, and his wife is a entrepreneur in her own right, owning plants and things like that, and knowing on a first name basis, you know, every general manager, every chairman of the board, and every president, because he worked right in the same building with them, for years. Yeah. I think I told you, I've been in Dick's office, and the phone would ring, and the secretary would say that Mr. Gerstenberg wants to talk to you, and Gerstenberg at that time is the chairman of the board, just recently financial vice president, and so they'd chew us out, come back in a few minutes, and Dick would be sitting there, you know, filing his nails or something. Where were we? But when things were popping down there, they would call Dick. And a lot of it was, Dick, when we developed the so-and-so, you know, the method of appropriating tooling and stuff like that, how did we do this? We tell him. So, typical General Motors guy. Okay. Ed Vogt, on the other hand, he came from a little division up in Grand Rapids, went down to central office, and he was there for years and years, longer than he thought he was going to be there, and was very happy to come to Olds, you know, worked right into the system, went to Dayton as controller down there, legal controller, and then came back, went right through the chairs, knew the whole General Motors system of the town, and he was not as gregarious, that's the right word, as Dick Elliott, but got the job done.
Any changes in management style through those three guys?
Yes, boy, it's hard to find a difference in management style between Schoen and Elliott. They pretty much said, "Go do it." Yeah. You know, Ed was into everything, and had his approach included in most everything that you did. He managed pretty closely, but like I say, he was, you know, there was no job too long. You work all night if you had to, you know, to get things done. Of course, he'd like to have you working there with him too, and I did. I mean, that was the way I was trained. So it didn't bother me much. It did bother a lot of people that they might have to skip a golf game or something, but that was just standard operating procedure. And the General Motors financial business, as far as I could see. Okay. I guess it's about it, Jim. We covered a lot. Yeah, and you know, I probably have forgotten a lot of things, although I filled a lot of your tapes. I'm a little embarrassed here. No, not to be embarrassed. Not to be embarrassed. I've got to get home.